Beginning. Okay, members, good afternoon. So today we're pretty focused in on the victims and survivors service with three different sets of briefings to come. We've had apologies from Megan Fearon and Brenda Hale. Any other points to note? Right on cue. We welcome to the committee Mr. David McElveen and say goodbye to George Robinson. Leslie Cree has also left the committee. Roy Beggs, I think, may be joining us this week, but he has a clash with the Public Accounts Committee. Jimmy, do you?
I was just going to suggest, Chair, that through yourself, write a letter to the both members.
Oh yes, if everybody's content.
Yeah.
Yeah. George would be long-standing.
He's been here a long time now, so he has.
Yep, more than happy to do that. Thank you, Jimmy. Members, page 6, you find an invitation from the University of Ulster. This is to a conference on transitional justice in the context of the European Convention, Article 2, and the package of measures. Also, a copy of the committee's current invitations is at page 8. Then at page 3 of tabled, we've got clarification from OFMDFM on funding for the University of Ulster's proposed campus relocation. This was raised by Ms Leslie Cree during the briefing on the Executive's EU priorities last month. Given Leslie's away, are we content to forward that correspondence to him? Yeah, thank you. Next is draft minutes of our meeting of the 17th of September 2014 from page 10 in your packs. Content to agree? Thank you. Page 17, in matters arising, correspondence from the NIPSO Bill team notes that at last week's meeting the committee indicated it was content with the changes tracked in the draft bill, which was included in our main meeting pack, subject to the reiteration of the objections by Sinn Féin, which are already on record. Now the bill team say that we're now close to having a final draft bill, and what they would like us to consider is scheduling 15 minutes of closed session at the beginning of our meetings for the rest of the month and next month, so that they can keep the project moving without too much fuss. And it wouldn't be their intention to use that 15 minutes every week, but should they need an urgent response from us, 15 minutes is more than enough, and they would like to have it scheduled. Yep, thank you very much. Bill team also suggests we write to the Assembly Commission to remind the Commission of the role proposed for it in the draft bill, the provisional timetable for the passage of the bill, and the preparatory action which the Commission may wish to consider. Content that we'll take those actions? Thank you. I can refer you to page 18 of your packs, where you'll see an updated list of submissions received to date with regard to our inquiry into building a united community. This includes a link to the folder which has been created for members to access the papers through the ECP system. Now, if anybody has any difficulty accessing papers, please let staff know. Closing dates is this Friday, 10th of October. In the absence of comment, could I direct you to page 21, the list of outstanding correspondence. Again, pause for comment. If not, can I refer you to the correspondence? Yes.
Can I just make one comment? Was the item under date issued 24th of October 2013, request for review on funding coming under VSS order for threat paramilitaries. That was basically a request for some clarification from the department with regards to whether someone coming under threat by a paramilitary was eligible for victims and survivors service assistance.
Yep.
I don't think we've received a response to that almost a year later. My understanding was that the department's hold-up was that they were seeking advice from, I think it was the Victims Commissioner at the time, but it's obviously long past urgent. It would be useful to see if we could raise that with them again.
Yep. Members content? I think the issue, Deputy Chair, is always, if you exclude somebody because they're under paramilitary threat, you are effectively saying that the paramilitaries are saying this person is guilty of something.
Yeah, I think it had a practical basis to it as well, in that there were groups providing significant amount of assistance to people who found themselves under paramilitary threat, and indeed managing to get those threats dealt with and removed, which is obviously of huge benefit to the individual and our wider community. So, but then they were unable to access funding for that work. So it had an urgency to it, which is unfortunately probably now past, but nonetheless I don't think the department should be let off the hook of having to respond to what was quite an important inquiry.
Well, two things, I suppose, members. I'm assuming we're all on the same page here, that being under a paramilitary threat does not imply guilt against the individual.
Absolutely, yeah.
And secondly, that we write to the department to remind them it's nearly a year since we requested the information.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So page 24, you've got correspondence received since the last meeting, spread out in a summary sheet. I'll ask the clerk to highlight items that require a decision by the committee. You can, of course, highlight any other correspondence that you wish to at this time.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you. The first item I'd like to draw members' attention to is at page 29. It's an update on delivering social change, and it includes the announcement of the 3 new signature programmes relating to services for people with dementia, support for young families, and the expansion of shared education, which were discussed to some degree last week during the October monitoring session. And it's just to check if members wish to write to the department to ask for further information, because no information has been received as yet on those programmes.
Agreed.
Thank you. And the second one is the Central Good Relations Funding Programme at page 43. And it just details a request for the breakdown of the amount of funding to groups in receipt of funds from the Central Good Relation Fund, and just to check if members wish to ask for more information on the funding criteria in respect of that fund. And that's it, unless there are any other.
Nothing else, members?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So it's item 7, members. We move into our assessment of the Victims and Survivors Service. At our strategic planning meeting at the beginning of September in Dungannon, remember we agreed issues would continue to be a key strategic priority for us in this term. 3 briefings have been scheduled there for today, and this is the first one, which comes from Assembly Research. Michael Potter was with us at our strategic day and took up the challenge of doing some research for us on financial matters. The paper from Michael begins at page 51 of your packs. You may also wish to take on board members' correspondence from the department regarding funding, location and running costs. That has been tabled at page 5. Michael.
Thank you, Chair. The committee asked me to undertake research on the locations of groups in receipt of funding from the Victims and Survivors Service, Community Relations Council and under Priority 1.2 of the Peace 3 programme. The amount of funding received by each, including a breakdown between administration and programme costs where possible. Additional information on Scheme 6 and some comment on the progress of the strategy for victims and survivors. Now, I'm very aware that things have moved on a bit since the paper was submitted to the committee, so I'll give a broad overview, and then perhaps the VSS will answer a lot of the questions that you might be asking me. So there we go. The paper gives an overview of the funding landscape for victims and survivors, and all groups in receipt of OFMDFM or Peace 3 funding are listed in the appendices. So all the groups and all their locations and what they've received is all there for you. Information is given on the various programmes, including Scheme 6, and the reviews of the Victims and Survivors Service are just summarised. So, the strategy for victims and survivors was launched in November 2009 and established the current funding landscape for victims and survivors of the conflict. Formerly, OFMDFM funding for individuals affected by the conflict and groups that support them was distributed through the Community Relations Council. Individuals could also receive support from the Northern Ireland Memorial Fund. The strategy set out a new structure for victims and survivors, which broadly comprised the Victims Commission to provide advocacy and advice, the Victims Forum to advise the Commission, and the Victims and Survivors Service to distribute funding. Some £50 million was allocated to victims and survivors in the 2011 to 2015 budgets. So the VSS has two main programmes: the Victim Support Programme, which provides small and large grants to groups supporting victims and survivors, and the Individual Needs Programme, which provides funding for individuals in 6 schemes. And those are education and training, care for carers, 2 schemes for support for the injured, respite breaks and financial assistance, and that's the scheme 6. 2 of those, respite breaks and training and education, were deferred at the time of the research. Scheme 6 opened 2 phases this year, Phase 1 for the seriously injured and Phase 2 for other applicants. Phase 1 was not means tested, but Phase 2 was. £1.644 million was allocated to Scheme 6 for 2014 to 15, for which there were 2,119 applications, 187 of which were still being processed at the time of the research. It appears that there were far more new applications than had been the case before, so the total amount had to be divided between more people. Support groups. Groups that have been allocated funding from the VSS, and the amounts are listed at Appendix 1 of the paper in front of you. Groups that received funding through the Community Relations Council between April 2011 and the handover to the VSS in 2012, and the amounts they received are listed at Appendices 2 and A3, so they're all listed there. In all, 110 separate organisations have been allocated funds from OFMDFM by either route from 2011 to 2015. These are mapped across Northern Ireland by parliamentary constituency and compared with statistics of fatalities due to the conflict, the results of which are shown on a map on page 18. It's page 18 in the paper. It might be a different page on your...
It's 70.
Yes. So that basically maps, it overlays fatalities in the conflict with locations of groups by constituency. As you can see, correlation between the deaths and support organisations is close in some areas, such as in North and West Belfast and Upper Bann. Less so in areas such as West Tyrone and Fermanagh and South Tyrone. But there are important caveats to this that have to be pointed out. The first thing is mapping deaths is a very crude measure of conflict impact and leaves out many other factors and variables. Secondly, organisations differ significantly in terms of the communities they support and the services they provide, from groups that specifically support victims and survivors across a range of needs to general service providers, of which services to victims and survivors is just part of their work. And also the map takes no account of geographical factors such as rurality or population density. So if you can bear all those in mind when you're looking at the map there. In its evidence to this committee in May of this year, the VSS stated it was satisfied that there was no duplication of services in locations where there were larger numbers of groups. Piece 3 then. Groups have also received assistance under Priority 1.2 of the EU Piece 3 programme, distributed via the Community Relations Council and by POBL. A list of groups that were allocated funding under Priority 1.2 is at Appendix 4, with all the amounts they received. These funds total some £37 million between 2007 and 2013, and some spend is still taking place on the Piece 3 programme. In total, excluding duplicates and organisations located outside Northern Ireland, 146 separate organisations have received funding from OFMDFM or through Piece 3. Groups can also apply for funding from other sources, for example, other priorities of Piece 3, community relations related programmes from the Community Relations Council, or other significant funders such as the International Fund for Ireland, Atlantic Philanthropies, the Department of Foreign Affairs, or funding distributed by local councils, just to name a few. On the question of the balance between administration and programme costs, it's not been possible to assess this in relation to specific groups receiving funding. Indeed, it would be unfair to do so on some groups and not others. Guidance for applications and for assessment from the VSS does not appear to offer direction on the proportion of administration costs and programme costs, but that's not to say that no such assessment is made in practice. So reviews of the strategy then. The first 4 years of the Commission were reviewed by KPMG, which found that it had not provided value for money and had not had the impact intended, although the Commission had engaged with stakeholders to build relationships during that time. The VSS was independently reviewed by WKM Solutions and SIPFA, both of which found significant weaknesses in strategic leadership, governance and operational management. However, both reviews noted willingness in the staff of the VSS to persevere in the absence of strategic leadership. And these findings were reiterated by the Commissioner in her advice to Government following those reviews. At the time of the research, the Commission was without a Commissioner, and the VSS without a Chief Executive and a Chair of its board. That concludes the brief overview, Chair.
Okay, Michael, thank you very much. Members are open for comments. I think, Michael, one of the things that strikes me, if I've read and heard correctly, 146 organisations have received funding either through OFMDFM or through peace funding. 146.
But that would include, Chair, organisations that provide things like mental health services to the community that also deal with victims, or alternative therapies, that kind of thing.
Yeah, the 146 are not all dedicated exclusively to victims and survivors of the Troubles.
And there are a number of groups that would provide specific services to specific areas of the community, such as ex-services personnel, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay, members? Well, Michael, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. Members, as you know, we've been receiving regular updates from the Victims and Survivors Service with regard to implementation of the recommendations of the reports Michael mentioned, the WKM Solutions and SIPMA. However, it did come to our attention over the summer, new challenges have emerged. We had the resignations of both the Chair and the Chief Executive. And then there were also the budgetary pressures following the outcome of the June monitoring round. So again, at our strategic planning meeting early September, we agreed to invite the interim chair and interim CEO to brief the committee on the current situation. So we welcome Mr. Oliver Wilkinson, who is the interim chair of the Victims and Survivors Service, and Ms. Margaret Bateson, who's the interim chief executive officer. In your packs, members, from page 103, you'll find a copy of the interim chair's opening remarks. There's an impact paper beginning at page 108, which outlines the financial position, and then at page 112 and thereafter progress against those two reviews by WKM and SIPFA. And finally, at page 125 is a response from the VSS to queries raised by the committee regarding means testing for applicants. Oliver and Margaret, thank you very much for joining us. As members have your opening remarks in their packs, is there anything you would like to highlight, Oliver, just at this point?
Well, have members had an opportunity to read through the remarks, or would you like me just to pick some of the key points from it?
I think if you go for the key points, Oliver, that would be useful. Thank you.
Yeah, as has been mentioned, we have our chief executive and chair stepped down recently, so that has in itself presented challenges for the organisation. But more significantly, we are working in an environment where our financial circumstances are a lot less favourable than they have been in the past, and we have had to make some very difficult decisions. Those decisions we know and we hear every day have had a significant impact on many difficult and many individuals who live in very difficult circumstances, who carry lifelong injury, who are that is both physical and psychological, and our staff are each day having to try to find sensitive ways of saying to people, we are not able to give you all that you perhaps wanted, and in other circumstances we're not able to help people at this stage. We are hoping that our budget position will improve now in October monitoring, which will enable us to help certainly those who have been bereaved and others who have chronic injury. So we're hopeful, but we do appreciate the financial circumstances that all departments are under. Having said that, some of the good things are we have now, I would say, very good working relationship with Department and with the Commission. We are well positioned to begin to do some real work in addition to that which we have already done. That which we have already done is in response to the recommendations in the 2 reports that have come to us. There were something like 70 recommendations. 65 have been either implemented or partially implemented, and that's at a time when we have had significant budget reduction and the difficulties that I mentioned with two key members of the organisation having left. So I think our staff should be complimented for the work that they have done in addressing the recommendations to the extent that they've been able to do so. In doing that, I would have to acknowledge the support that we have been given by both the Department and the Commission. And finally, we have seen as a priority over the past 6 months and more to get to know and to work closely with the Forum. We attend all of their meetings at their request. We appreciate the fact that in the difficult messages that we have had to get out recently, they have been helpful to us in understanding just how difficult those messages have been to get out to people. But we have explained as best we can to them why and how we are doing the things that we are doing. And tomorrow I meet with them again, and I'm quite sure that while we still will have difficult conversations, at least we're going in the right direction. Beyond that, we're pleased to be here, and we're very happy to answer, to the best of our ability, any question that the committee might have.
I appreciate that, Oliver. Thank you. The first question I want to ask, you'll understand why I'm asking it. I just want to acknowledge before I do that you may feel that you cannot answer it, perhaps because you don't know the answer, or you may feel you can't answer it because while you do know the answer, you don't think it would be appropriate to say so in an open session, but you may be able to shed light. So I shall ask the question. We've lost the Commissioner, we've lost the Chairman of your body and the Chief Executive of your body. Is there any reason to believe those 3 resignations are related?
I'll answer to the best of my ability. I am not aware of any direct relationship between one and the other.
Okay, appreciate that. Could we turn then to the finances, because I think there is some clarification required. In your briefing paper, and this is page 103, members of your pack, you say the opening budget position for 2014-15 was communicated to the VSS in May 2014 of £11.7 million. And following June monitoring, this position was reduced to 10, and an additional bid of 1.6 at that time was unsuccessful. I have a letter from First Minister and Deputy First Minister saying the Victims and Survivors Service has been allocated a current resource budget of 10 million, which includes a 4.4% reduction applied across all departments due to budget constraints. A bid of 1.3 million has been made on October monitoring. So they seem to be saying, the Minister seemed to be saying your opening budget was 10, but you're saying it was 11.7.
Every arm's length body is given a grant and aid letter at the start of each year outlining what their budget position is, and the Victims and Survivors Service received that letter in May 2014, and the opening budget position was 11.685 million. And based on that position, we then entered into contractual arrangements and commitments for the year ahead.
11.65.
685 million.
11.685. But this letter says it started at 10, and if the 1.3 million bid is successful in October monitoring, that will take you up to 11.3. So this 11.6 isn't mentioned anywhere in the letter from the ministers.
11.685, I presume, is rounded
Yep.
up to 11.7.
Which is your figure, but it's not the figure in the letter from First Minister and Deputy First Minister. It's 10 plus 1.3.
Chair, maybe we could get some clarity. Maybe, do you expect to have the full amount at the beginning of a financial year? Would you not get it in previous years? You've got it in your monitoring as well. So
Last
you
year-
mightn't have 11.65 million sitting on the first day of the financial year. That would come to you over the period of the year. I think that makes sense.
So, no, Jimmy, just so if you want to ask a question,
Just want
please.
clarity on it, but the clarity on the point that you're trying to...
I'm trying to see clarity at this, Mr. Spratt.
Last year we received an opening budget position of 11.3 million, and then we bid in year for an additional 1.1 to bring us up to 12.4 million. And then towards the end of the year we also were allocated some departmental underspend of 400,000, so the budget available to us was 12.8 million last year. The opening budget position in terms of the grant and aid letter to the service for this current financial year that we're in was 11.685 million, which is where the 11.7 million on the paper. The first that we were aware of a 10 million budget was the last week in July of this year, and it was at that point that then we started taking cost efficiency exercises internally to try and maximise the amount of expenditure that we could allocate to the programmes and minimise the corporate costs of the VSS.
Okay. Is the figures, Margaret, that you're quoting for financial year 13-14 tally with the letter from the ministers? 11.3, then 1.1 in monitoring, 12.4 total, but the figures for this financial year do not add up. The 4.4% reduction, you have had to ask the groups that you fund to absorb 4.4% reductions in efficiencies. Yeah. How has that played with those groups?
We communicated with the groups at the start of August, and we did that in writing, just outlining the pressures across the Northern Ireland Executive and the impact that they'd also had on the service. During the months then of August and September, each of our project officers went on site with each of the groups to try and assist them identifying where they could make savings. Really with the priority of maximising frontline delivery and trying to ensure most of the savings could take place in administrative costs. As a result of that, officers reported back in September that all of the groups would be able to find 4.42%, with the exception of 3 organisations, and we're currently working with those 3 organisations to see what we can do to help further there. One organisation has stated that they would have to close a regional office, and for 2 other organisations we really only fund development workers, so it's one person's salary. But I suppose, in summary, it has been difficult for the organisations. They'll face the same difficulties that we have internally. And it's really in terms of the timing. Asking an organisation halfway through the year to find 4.42% saving is really like asking them to find 8-9% in their second half of the year. But as is normal, most of your commitments are entered into at the start of the year, so contracts are signed, staff contracts are in place, and it's extremely difficult for them to find those savings.
And are those savings coming off administrative costs only, or are programmes being affected as well?
Programmes are being affected as well. And like the service, the organisations have also seen increases in numbers coming forward for across all areas, health and wellbeing and social support. So the difficulty is that for new individuals coming forward, the current letters of offer were insufficient to support those. But secondly, for the individuals that they're currently assisting, they are having to find some of the cost savings in frontline delivery. For the reasons I outlined, a lot of the corporate running costs are already contracted and committed at the start of the year.
And it has also impacted, of course, in the work in the VSS. I believe 7 agency staff have been laid off.
7 agency staff during the month of July, August and September.
Okay. In your briefing paper, you say in the short term the department has provided an additional resource to ensure statutory and governance arrangements can be met within the VSS. Well, can you tell us what that additional resource is?
The additional resource is an accountant from the department who's working in the service 3 or 4 days a week. That individual isn't undertaking any operational role. It's really in terms of internal audit recommendations, external audit recommendations. We've made a commitment that we would review policies, procedures, strengthen systems, make efficiencies across our IT systems. So the individual's assisting us with those types of activities as opposed to an operational role.
Can you describe what a working day is like in the VSS? Is it a pleasant place to work?
A working day is extremely busy within the VSS. I think if you ask staff in the VSS, they would agree. We have tried, since I started at the start of August, to ensure that the workload is manageable. I'm aware that staff are under an immense amount of pressure, and the criticism that comes externally has a direct impact on staff morale. We've put in place mechanisms to ensure staff are supported. One-to-one supervision meetings on a monthly basis, with a staff planning day in September, at the 2nd of September, and the purpose of that was really to ensure that the workload was spread evenly across the organisation and to identify where individuals from different teams could assist really on front line, particularly around the call handling, to try and minimise pressure on individuals and individual teams.
Just to add, if I can, Chair, put some figures and hopefully some sense to those. We have approximately 500 telephone calls per week. That could be someone who is making a quick telephone call to say, can you send me out some information? But equally, that could be someone who is very distressed and who needs very careful handling on a lengthy telephone call. Which is both stressful for the individual making the call, but also for the staff member who is dealing with that. In addition, and what people often miss is that there are at least 50 people each week walking in from the street. Maybe 60% of those people we have not met before. We don't know who the individual is or what's the level of distress that person is bringing with them. And again, some of those conversations are with people who are very damaged, and that can be expressed in grief or anger or whichever way. There is not a moment that I go into the office that there isn't one or more than one person sitting there waiting to be seen. So this isn't just an administrative office processing paper. There are real people walking in every day with very distressed circumstances that our staff are having to deal with, and that is, and I'm very grateful to them for what they're able to do, but they are under severe pressure.
Well, I think everyone around this table, as a constituency MLA and with their staff, would be aware of dealing with the public, that there are people who need a significant input of time.
I'm quite sure.
And it's very difficult for the individual to come forward, and it's also very stressful to be the recipient of the information that that the individual wants to offload. Can I ask you, Oliver, just on the phone calls, you indicate in the paper calls should be returned within 24 hours, although some more complex cases may take up to 72 hours. I was just seeking clarification on that.
Yeah.
If it's a complex case and we assume, therefore, you're talking about a particularly vulnerable person, are they left for 72 hours, or are you saying that there would be a number of phone calls to reassure them that their case is being processed, but it could take 72 hours to get the result?
And Margaret, if you could help me with this, in a certain month we were dealing with over 4,200 telephone calls coming into the centre. We have 6 people dedicated to dealing with those. There were occasions when we simply weren't able to deal with the call, so we were having people ring and drop off. We had to do something about that, and we now at that point, we did the best that we could in the circumstances, and we linked the individual up with NI Direct. Not the best solution, but it is a solution. And they have provided a very good service to us at a time when we needed them to do so. We are pleased to advise that from the end of, the projections are from the end of September, we will be back to dealing with those calls ourselves and ourselves alone, and that every call will be responded to within 24 hours.
Can I ask the sort of mirror question that I asked Margaret? You're chairing a board. SIPFA had already said you didn't have as many board members as you would need, given the pressures and the demands upon that board. Since then, the board has shrunk for factors beyond your control. Where does that leave you? How easy is it to chair the VSS?
In a curious way, there's a strength in very small numbers, because you gather together and support one another. But it is not a good situation. We need to increase our board members so that we can have the sufficient breadth and range of expertise to give the kind of leadership that a very challenging organisation like this needs. There are 3 of us. That means we are quorate. But if one of us disappears, we can't make a decision. That's where it gets very serious. I'm pleased that the department have been working with us now for quite a while to try and move that forward, and applications are currently in the press for new board members. So again, that's going to take a number of months, but at least we're going in the right direction. So we are just about able to cope right now, but the challenge to us is a lot less than it is to our frontline staff.
Two more questions before I bring in other members who are keen to talk to you. There was a bid for 1.3 million in October monitoring, and the background indications seem to be that it has a good chance of success. What will that money be used for?
The money will be used for 2 key areas. The most pressing priority for us, we're aware that senior management team and the board have had to make some very difficult decisions during the month of August. And as a result of those decisions, we're aware that under the individual needs programme, the deferment of the education and training and the respite breaks have caused considerable distress, particularly to the bereaved. The decision we had to take at the time was to prioritise chronic pain needs. So the priority for that funding would be to ensure that there's access to services for the bereaved. And we're also aware that due to the budget restrictions at the time for the injured, that it's been limited to those who are in DLA, and we're aware that there are other people out there who are injured who may have ongoing chronic pain needs. So they would be our first 2 priorities. And thirdly, we have some internal priorities within the service in terms of vacant positions that we need in order to strengthen that frontline service delivery. And we also have some corporate governance costs in relation to the implementation of the CVS recommendations, such as strengthening the number of members on the board, internal audit function and external audit function. But in terms of that 1.3 million, 1 million would go directly on frontline service delivery.
Would it cover some of the efficiencies you've made, such as suspending training for staff? And I'm conscious it would.
It does, yeah.
I'm conscious staff, the pressures you've mentioned, the criticisms that have come, including from within this room. It does seem like a double blow to then find that you can't even get training to potentially rectify any valid criticisms. That will be back on course. So then there's a second bid, a bigger bid of 1.7 on top of the 1.3. What would that be used for?
That would be, so as I said, the bereaved and the other injured would be our pressing priorities, but we're also aware that last year we opened up the schemes to a much larger number of people. The 1.7 million was to ensure that the same value of funding went back into the individual needs programme as the previous year. It was also to ensure that other vacant positions that we would say were critical but less critical in terms of the VSS could be fulfilled. And also in terms of the victim support programme, we do know that the groups out there are also seeing increase in demand coming forward, and it was in some cases to reinstate the 4% efficiency saving where it had an impact on frontline delivery. And secondly, there are 9 organisations who have been through our independent assessment panel where the applications have been approved, but due to the budget restrictions we haven't been able to issue those letters of offer.
Any of those likely to close if the 1.7 bid doesn't come through?
There are 2 organisations within that group that we understand are likely to close at Christmas time. They're currently operating off reserves.
Can you tell us who they are, or is that confidential?
Sure. I think it's pretty much public knowledge who the groups are. So it would be Ards Phoenix and Pat Finucane Centre.
Within that second bid also there are ministerial commitments which will be unmet if the money doesn't come through, such as the 24-hour telephone callback.
I think the 24-hour telephone callback is something that we monitor on a weekly basis. We did have a 3-week period in September where we weren't able to meet that, and that was due to the capacity on the front line in terms of responding to the calls, and that's why we put in the temporary solution of NI Direct, and we issue communication to all our group staff for their assistance in helping us support individuals calling the service. As of last week, we're back on the 24-hour KPI. Our concerns are that when additional funding becomes available, that expectations would be built again in October, and that we'll again see peak activity telephone calls. And our concern is that again we'll not be able to meet the 24 KPI, but it's something that's managed on a weekly basis by the officer responsible for that team and reported to the senior management team on a weekly basis.
Okay, thank you. Stephen Woodry.
Thank you, Chair. And at the outset, can I wish you well as you move forward from a very difficult immediate past.
Thank you.
In relation to the staffing reductions that the Chair referred to, 7 agency staff, what's that of a total complement of, and what is the nature of the jobs that have been lost?
We have an approved staffing complement of 31 staff for this current financial year. It's probably important to see that in the context of the previous financial year as well, where we'd an approved complement of 37 staff. The assumption being that the activities would decrease in year 2, which we haven't seen. The current staffing numbers are 27. So really, we've came from a 37 to a 27 over a 6-month period. The 7 agency staff were individual needs programme claims processing, client services manager and a client services staff officer. We have restructured internally. We started that process with staff on the 2nd of September, the staff planning day. And we met again last week and again yesterday with the team leaders. And we have reallocated staff from corporate services and programmes into the individual needs programme and into frontline delivery to make sure that 24-hour callback can still be maintained.
Okay. Oliver, in your opening statement, you referred to the improved relationships with both the Department and the Commission.
Yeah.
You know, I know it's early days, but how would you assess the relationships currently with the users, given what has happened in the immediate past?
Yeah, it is always going to be difficult because we are the ones who are saying to the individual out there that we can either give you funding, we can give you some, or we can't give you any. So for many people, giving them that message, I'm sorry, but we can't provide you with funding at this stage, is always going to be a difficult thing to do. And we fully appreciate that in those circumstances, individuals will feel the need, perhaps in some circumstances, to blame us. And I would want to defend the staff and VSS on this issue. They have been, in my view, blamed for too long for things which were not their responsibility. It's a difficult message. There is a responsibility on them to deliver that message professionally and well. And they have to do that, and we constantly monitor that to make sure it's done properly. And I'm confident that it is being done properly. We invite people to complain, we encourage them, but importantly, we have spent a lot of time in getting our website right, so that we are giving information early to people about what it is that is happening, rather than the criticism that we have had in the past, which was that things were happening and people didn't know. We are also working very closely with the groups, as Margaret has said, to make sure that they explain to people who are coming in through their doors what it is that is happening. The forum have been a very important resource to us over the past 6 months. And we are obviously then working with the department and the commission to make sure that a consistent and a straightforward message is being delivered, rather than 3 different messages from different organisations. And that way we're trying to make sure that the right message gets out in the right way. But I appreciate that when you're telling people that something they had last year they don't get this year, it's going to be hard.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Deputy Chair Chris Little.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you for your presentation. It's good to hear from you today. I'm going to use OFMDFM figures to avoid any criticism of myself, but the OFMDFM figures say that the opening allocation for you in May was 11.3 million, and then you were advised in July that that was reduced to 10 million. I think any organisation that experiences that level of in-year reduction has my sympathy, and I think it is important that we extend good wishes to you and all the staff in the service who are working under those extremely difficult circumstances. Can I ask you to, within the short time that we have, give some sort of 1 or 2 examples of the way in which those reductions have impacted on someone experiencing the service? You say in your brief there are many victims who availed of services last year which we are unable to provide again this year. Can you give an example, within the individual needs programme, of what that means in reality to a victim and survivor?
I think one of the key examples would be the bereaved, where people have lost a loved one and for a number of years have been able to avail of a respite break or education and training. With both those schemes closed, there's certainly frustration and anger and distress with those individuals who translate that as they're not a victim anymore, they're not being treated as a victim anymore, and that's an extremely difficult message for staff when working with individuals coming in to give that message. So certainly the bereaved, and that's why that's one of our key pressing priorities if additional funding becomes available. And likewise, last year we carried out the individual needs reviews on the basis of need, and individuals coming forward were provided funding with the chronic pain that they needed. So there's no cap on that. So it meant people would have had a package of care, and it could have been physiotherapy with counselling sessions, with a respite break, and there was a holistic package provided. This year, due to the budget restrictions, we have had to make the difficult decisions to cap those amounts, and it means that individuals are then having to choose which services are most valuable to them. I don't know if Oliver wants to add anything to that.
No, but on that last one, where someone has been receiving a form of therapy, complementary or otherwise, which has helped them to sleep better at night, and that then stops. That is a very, very difficult situation for that individual to find themselves in. So that's as personal as it gets. It's important to understand that others see the funding they receive as an acknowledgement of them as a victim or a survivor. and taking away something which up until this point they have seen as proper and dignified acknowledgement of them as individual victim survivors. Taking that away from them has significant emotional and psychological consequences.
I know how difficult it is to persuade and convince some victims and survivors that there is a new service in place further to many, many years of not being able to access any type of assistance. So I can only imagine the challenge that you have to communicate that change in service provision and try to retain victims and survivors who want to be willing to avail of those services on an ongoing basis. One last question. There's two programs, the Victim Support Programme, which is for groups, and Individual Needs Programme for individuals. How does the budget split between those two programmes, and who decides how that gets split?
There was a business case for funding prepared over a 2-year period, I think back in 2011, 2012. And as a result of that, there were budget allocations assigned to each of the programmes. So £10 million per year was allocated for programmes, £6 million victim support programme and £4 million for the individual needs programme, and then in addition to that the VSS corporate costs being the total budget we would require for the year, so 6 million, 4 million. The difficulty this year is obviously we've 10 million which must also include the VSS costs. The victim support programme is issued over a 2-year period. So those contracts for the 2 years were issued in the main in April 2013. So we're now year 2, we're 18 months into a 2-year programme. So those commitments and those contractual commitments were already made. So in reducing the letters of offer, the victim support programme is still maintained at around £5.7 million, which means this year there's 2.8 million for the individuals at this current point in time, and obviously any funding we get in October monitoring will be prioritised into that programme. So
you've had to take more from the individual programme because there's contractual commitments on the groups programme?
And really that comes down to the timing of the cut. If you know at the start of a financial year you can start making savings quicker, but when it's 6 months into the year, many of those contracts are already signed and legally binding at that point, and it's difficult then to...
The Victims Commissioner advice in relation to groups, or WKM Solutions report, refers to some groups perhaps holding on to victims and survivors for financial or political reasons. These are not my words, this is WKM Solutions report, for financial or political reasons. I'm aware that this is a view held by others, and groups would be well advised to work to counter this perception. The Victims Commissioner advice then goes on to say the VSS should give careful consideration to reviewing the assessment of the quality of groups' applications, and also to consider how there is a separation of political activity from advocacy and welfare support. Can you say, how you've responded to that advice that has been given?
If I could say, we have excellent organisations right across our community who, at a time when we're unable to help individual victims to the extent that we want, they're there. They were there before we were there, and they're still there providing excellent services. And I hear criticism that perhaps they're holding on to individuals. I would like to see that fully and properly researched, and that to be done in partnership with the Commission, with the Department, with the groups themselves, and with the information that we have to hand that we can make available to enable that to take place. We would welcome that. But right now, at a time when individuals are getting less, I would not want to make any criticism of the groups that are out there and are holding the line in circumstances where we just at the moment are unable to do so. And after all, we're, through the taxpayer, we're providing them with money to provide services. We expect them to do so, and from what I see as I go around and meet with them, they're doing exactly that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Maxie.
Chair, thank you. Well, I appreciate your last remark, sir, because I think we can all accept that there's a big diversity of views out there within the victim survivor sector, and it's not for any of us here or any consultant, or in my view, to be saying that somebody's hanging, how do you hang on to a victim? I just really can't understand that idea. It doesn't cost money for somebody to make a publicity statement, or it may be in some people's eyes a political statement, but I think your last point is that people get funding to deliver whatever they're going to deliver, and providing to deliver that, then that should be, in my view, the value for money and what they're there to do. I mean, there may well be somebody might say something I may not like, but that's tough. You have to live with the fact that there are people out there with very diverse opinions, and some very strongly held, and why would it not be? So I do appreciate your remarks on that. For me, I think this has been fairly well covered today. I mean, in terms of the limitations of any budget, and particularly this one that we're talking about today. And I raised the case here recently, and I do appreciate it's everybody around the table could also raise individual cases, and but it's just by way of illustration. So I'm going to acknowledge that everybody could do likewise, but I have raised this recently in the committee. I'm very patient with it, and it really is just. I mean, you've covered it in a way, but it is in relating to a person who is a member of a big family, so they've got a number of siblings, but yet and all, say the father killed, a brother killed, and another one seriously injured, and finds it deeply hurtful that even amongst the siblings there's a different treatment. So it goes back to her being actually now angry and hurt that she does not believe that she's being considered a victim, because the first thing she came to me and asked, what is a victim? How do you define a victim? Because if I'm not treated the same as my brother or my sister or somebody else, why am I called a victim? And as her words to me was, I wouldn't care if we all got a fiver or a box of chocolates. I think we should be treated the same. That was her words, and she wasn't being any way flippant. She was making the point. She wasn't saying she wanted X numbers of pounds, but she wanted some access to services on the basis that she has been bereaved, and causes division within families, never mind between groups or anybody else. So, I mean, I just raised that case by way of illustration, and I know you've already identified that you do find it difficult, and your staff would find it very difficult to talk to families like that or people like that. So I'm just trying to work out, what do you say to them and what do we say to them in those circumstances? You may not be able to fully answer that today because it's individual based, but you know, I mean, you have covered it at length, and I have to say I want to appreciate the way in which you've both presented here this afternoon, because it'll be while that, you know, I've heard the way in which you've outlined the case both kind of eloquently and passionately, and very well explained. And I know the committee has, through the chair, has probably indicated to yourselves that we obviously have been trying to take a more hands-on approach, working with the department, working with yourselves and the commission before she resigned. But we're also equally mindful not to be an additional burden to the work that you have to get on with, and you're very stretched. So I want to just put that on the record. To appreciate your presentation here today and the work that you're doing against very difficult backdrop. But how do we address people who, in the case that I've outlined, find themselves actually now feeling very angry and hurt that they're not a victim, but in actual fact, unfortunately, they really are?
I think there are two ways. One is that we continue to do what we're doing, and additional money is provided to the service to develop the range of services that we have. Quite frankly, I don't think that's possible. We need to sit down and seriously look at a different way, a better way of providing the services that we're providing. That could be done, and conversations are taking place at the minute on this. That could be done and should be done with the department, the commission, ourselves, our groups and the forum and others, sitting down saying, on the basis of the information that we have so far, how can we better provide for the needs of victims and survivors for the next 10 years? I believe it's not beyond the gift of all of us to come up with a better way to make sure that some people are acknowledged by in some financial way. Others are just acknowledged by being recognised for who they are. But ultimately, that the needs of individuals are paramount in all of this, and we are providing for that better than we have been able to do so until now. I think the system has worked well to now, but the numbers coming in through the door are continuing to increase. But I think realistically, there isn't going to be sufficient money in the years ahead to meet for that increasing number. So we need to think more creatively about how we can use what funding we do have to best effect. We can do it, and maybe the circumstances that we're in now are going to push us to really put that right.
Thank you.
Just to follow up, if I may, on Mr. Maskey's point, Oliver, some years ago when I was in the Victims Commission, there was a very famous case where a husband was shot dead in the kitchen of the family home. One sibling witnessed it because they were in the kitchen. The other sibling was upstairs in their bedroom. And one sibling, the one who saw it, was helped, and the sibling who didn't see it was not helped. And it is preposterous to argue that just because you didn't see it, you were not traumatised. And it's this sense of, as Mr. Massey was saying,
Yeah.
an uneven playing field for members of the same family. Is, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The needs of those individuals might be different, but that they should be acknowledged.
Yes.
Is what we need to address.
Okay. Jimmy Spratt.
Thank you, Chair. And can I thank you for the presentation? I mean, I do know that you have a very difficult job, and I think it's already been said, your presentation today, you've been very frank in the way that you've answered questions, and that's, I think, been very helpful from our point of view. Just if we can go back to the telephone calls, and the other issue on top of the telephone calls was emails. Emails weren't being basically answered. I think it's almost a year since the last time that you were in front of the committee, and then flowed all of the recommendations, which I have to say, good on you for trying to implement or partially implementing most of the recommendations that came up from both the department and the commissioners. But in terms of the emails, are you answering folks back quickly by email, even though it's only a holding email to say we'll be in touch with you in the next 24 hours or whatever?
I understand that emails are being treated the same as telephone calls. So
quickly.
yes, and if you have examples that are not, I'd be happy
I'm
to
not making any. I just want, you know, given that that was one of the issues that the forum people raised with us the last time that they were here. And it's good to hear that there's a big improvement there. I think you said that telephone calls will be back to 24 hours before the end of October, was that correct?
They're back to 24 hours from last week.
And you're totally dealing with them now?
Not until the end of October. We don't want to do anything too quickly based on just 1 week, and we want to make sure that we do it in a structured way. So each week we'll be decreasing the number of calls that are going through. At the minute, a percentage go to NI Direct and a percentage go to us. By the end of October they'd all be coming to us, but we want to do that gradually, week on week, to make sure that we don't create another problem and react too quickly.
I think, Oliver, you made the suggestion that in the last while you have about 50 people per week, is it, walking in off the streets, and you said about 60% of those folks were new. Are you seeing a fairly substantial increase in people who aren't involved with any groups? Because this has always been something that I've raised, people who don't want to be involved in groups or anything else, but they have been victims, some of them fairly serious victims of the Troubles. Are they the people that you're more and more seeing coming in with individual needs?
We were recording that information very systematically probably a year ago when people were coming through the service, and at that point in time there was 1 in 4 who hadn't been part of a group. At the minute when people come in, we're explaining to them how the schemes are currently open, and obviously it's only opening to a very small amount of people, so we don't want to set people's expectation by asking them lots of information. So we're not capturing that. I would say just in terms of people coming in, 60% are new to us. I would say 60% are not part of a group as well. They are new individuals coming forward.
So there's an increase in individuals, and I think in one of the reports that we got from the research people in terms of the debate yesterday, groups have increased by 1/3 over the last 12 months. Is that correct?
I need to come back to you on that figure. I'm unsure where that would come from.
Well, perhaps you could come back to us on that, because I mean, that's one of the issues, that if there's an increase in the number of groups, well, that suggests that there's less money. I mean, if there's a pot of money, and you have to divide the cake up into 1/3 increase in the numbers that you have to deal with, that's one of the issues. And there's also some suggestions that there has been groups breaking up. In other words, there's been disputes, whatever, within groups, and they've broken into another or second group. And that may well account for some of those increase of 1/3.
Yeah.
Perhaps give us some information, or give the committee some information in relation
The
to that.
figure of 1/3 I can't relate to. For me, it's a handful more. It was a 2-year contract issued to all groups in April 2013, so vast majority of groups would have had a 2-year contract. So the number in this year is roughly the same as last year. There's a handful of extra groups, and they would be small community organisations, because the scheme stayed open for small community organisations. So there'd be organisations who would bring people together to go on respite breaks, or bring people together to go on personal development courses. They generally wouldn't be groups where we're actually funding salaries and things like that, community groups. So we'll come back to you with the exact figures, but 1/3 seems extremely high.
Just one final point. In terms of chronic pain, and I'm right in saying, I think that it's people who are on a high-level DLA get £1,000 for chronic pain relief. Up to £1,000.
1,500 from the 1st of September.
The 500 is for care, isn't it?
Yes, 500.
The additional 500, so it's 1,500. And then those who are on small rate DLA are about £600. Is that right?
They're not. Oh, I think maybe we're talking about scheme for chronic pain. No, I think under scheme 6, financial assistance, those who were on high rate DLA were not means tested and received £1,000, and then those under phase 2 received £650. So that, but under chronic pain, which is a separate scheme, support for the injured, it's currently open to those who are in high rate DLA, high care component or middle care component. And what happened before the budget reduction was we continued paying treatment plans up until the 31st of August, and then from the 1st of September onwards, those who are in high rate DLA, high care component, have £1,500 allocation until the end of the financial year to continue with those treatment plans or whatever other needs they have.
And in terms of those with chronic pain who are not on DLA, there are many. How do you deal with them?
At the moment, what we're saying is their priority for additional funding becoming available in October.
So they're individually assessed by your assessors, is that right?
We don't have assessors. Well, we've one assessor in-house at the minute, and that assessor's role is when individuals come in on a daily basis, if any are experiencing high levels of distress or anxiety, our assessor's always there in hand. But we have reduced the administration really around the schemes to try and ensure easy access. So at the minute, the assessor would do usually just a short conversation with the individual, as opposed, it's not a huge assessment, it's just a short conversation with the individual, either face to face or by telephone.
In terms of agency staff and the 7 that you've lost, it's always been acknowledged that that's a more expensive way to employ people. Why did you employ them by agency and not on contract, proper contract at the start? And in terms of some of the downsizing that has taken place, for instance, in Coleraine, where there's been staff surplus to requirements in some government departments. Has any discussions taken place with the department in relation to the possibility of getting staff from, say, some of the other government departments?
The reason why staff were in agency contracts at the time is under the business case for funding, which is over a 2-year period, the staff and structure and headcount is set in stone, really, in black and white. Once the service started up and running, as you know, things never work the way the paper thought they would 3 years ago. So we identified emerging pressures, which was essentially removing staff from the corporate services function and putting them into frontline delivery. And at that point in time, in September of last year, we resubmitted a staffing paper to the department saying, look, we'll stick with the same headcount, but here's actually where we need the people. And for that reason, there were 7 staff in temporary positions until that was approved. And then at that point, we were superseded really by the CVS review that took place. And now we've presented a new staffing structure again this week in terms of our interim needs between now and the end of the year.
And any discussions with the department in relation to where there might be surplus staff?
Yep. On your second point, so the department have already provided assistance in the form of the accountant for 3 or 4 days a week. We're in discussions at the minute for an additional member of staff to come down and help us merge our IT systems together, because we feel that we could find some efficiencies there. And we've been discussing with the department what our needs are for the next 6 months and then for the future period as well. Also the Commission as well, I should acknowledge, have provided us with admin support in terms of the current research project they're doing and helping us consolidate information together on that. So both the Commission and Department have been working closely with us, and they're aware of our staff and pressures and constraints and are proactively trying to help us with them.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Alexander.
A number of members have commented, rightly so, that you have been helpful to the committee in the questions and the answers that you've given to the questions, which I think is in some contrast to the situation a year ago, when after the Victims Commissioner advised people, formally alerted people about our concerns, there was a sense of denial in a number of places in relation to the gravity of the situation that was being faced by the VSS and the impact upon victims and survivors. My own view is that whoever was involved in the planning for the VSS didn't work through resource requirements properly. One of the successes, and that's not the right word, but one of the results and one of the intentions of the VSS was to reach out to hidden victims. Your evidence today has been that people are beginning to present. 60% of your client base is new, and that is replicated in other organisations. It was clear that those who were responsible for creating this whole new organisation didn't work through the resource situations, the consequences properly. And you're in part living with the consequences of all that. Maybe a lot in-house that I think you should be doing, but you're certainly living with the consequences of all that, which fell primarily to the responsibility of others. Can I go back to the question that the Chair raised? So at the beginning of this financial year, you were operating to a baseline figure that you were then advised in July was wrong. Is that the case?
We were operating to a baseline figure of 11.685 million per our grant and aid letter. Then following June, we made an additional bid at that point of 1.6 million in June monitoring. And following June monitoring then at the end of July, we were advised that our bid for 1.6 million had been unsuccessful and that our budget had been reduced to 10 million.
So who told you that your budget line was the 11.6 figure in April?
That came down as a standard grant and aid letter from the department.
So you got a formal offer to be then told that there wasn't the funding for that. Was that a consequence of the reductions following July monitoring, or was that a consequence of a false baseline in the first instance?
I'm unsure. I know the department will be able to answer that.
Well, what do you think it was?
I don't think I'd like to guess.
Just
well, we'll see what the officials say, but it does seem to me that there's a question about whether you were led to believe that a certain figure was secure, only to discover that it was a false baseline to begin with, independent of the issue of the consequences of June monitoring. And if that is the case, and I'm not saying it is, and we'll hear shortly if it is, if that is the case, I go back to what I was saying earlier about people not getting the resource commitment right in respect of the VSS generally. You referred to the implementation of the audit recommendations. I'm only just saying this for the record, and we've raised this before in the committee. I think we need to see where we are in terms of the implementation of those recommendations. You indicated where we are in terms of top-line implementation. I think we do need to get that information sooner rather than later, because otherwise we're in a bit of a vacuum. We don't know actually where things are. But can I ask you, when you drill into it, how much is going into the corporate function of the VSS in terms of overall percentage of your budget line? And how much is going into groups and services to individuals? What's the overall ballpark figure?
Last year we spent, well, I'll take last year as a full year, and then, so last year we spent 12.8 million, 2 million in corporate and 2.1 million in corporate and 10.7 in programme costs.
And the programme cost is monies that go, because the figures about ones going to grant or going to individual groups is about 6 billion, I think, last year. How much of it then went to individuals?
4.4 million, actually I think it rounds to 4.5 million, went directly to individuals last year.
So in terms of money going into the lives of victims, either through groups or to individuals, it was over 10 million.
10.7 million.
And the administration costs cover all the management costs and the assessments that are done and any consultants that are brought in.
Economic appraisals, independent panel costs, that's all within the corporate costs, even though there's a direct relation to the programmes.
There's three quick questions then, you'll probably be able to deal with them all. Issues that are beginning to emerge, a new generation of issues around the VSS, which may be financial in nature, but they might actually be administrative in problem. So the three issues are this question about specialist equipment going to severely disabled people, where we're getting reports that people are being denied access to appropriate wheelchairs. Secondly, questions being raised about groups getting funding where there wasn't a proper audit done in terms of their eligibility, and post-event eligibility assessment and checks being done. And thirdly, people being offered grant, not being able to take it up, to be told, and this is a breakdown in communication, to be told that the grant was time limited, and if they didn't take it up, they don't get it. But people saying they weren't told, and I can give you cases, that evidence, all of that. What would you say to all of that?
In relation to you mentioned wheelchair, that does come down to how much money we have that we can then give out. You see you hear the figure there of what we have, and I come back to something I said earlier. We have to find a better way of dealing with situations like this. We have to find a way in which we are linking more of what we are doing with health and social care. We couldn't right now pass this problem across to our health and social care colleagues, but we could work towards a position whereby that could happen and a more effective service be provided for people in this category. That's what we need to do if we are not able to provide, if more money cannot be provided to us to do what we were able to do last year or previously. The eligibility, I'm not sure.
The eligibility, I think, refers back to the Gateway to Services process that was opened in February.
Just after the INR
Just after
stopped.
the
Yes.
individual needs review stopped. And at that point, in terms of to improve the access to the schemes, the groups themselves then were carrying out the Gateway to Services process. and where a group had signed off on a gateway to services process, the VSS didn't conduct any further eligibility checks. If someone came directly through the service, the VSS did carry out the normal eligibility checks. That was on the basis that the group had applied under the Victim Support Programme, and as part of the assessment process under that, the independent panel assessing the application would have to satisfy themselves that they had checks and balances in place in order to ensure that the services they were providing were to victims and survivors. There were concerns then raised during that period of time that some of the individuals coming through may not have been eligible for the individual needs programmes, and concerns that the volumes coming through. We have carried out eligibility checks on those, and at the minute 92% of people presenting themselves either through the groups or through the service are eligible. We're not seeing a difference between what comes through the groups and what comes through the VSS. My point is they're both showing roughly the same percentages, which would suggest that there weren't significant issues in terms of eligibility of individuals coming through groups.
You do appreciate that that change took place on foot of the recommendations from the Commissioner, that the assessment that we were conducting prior to that was seen as too onerous, too stressful. So a more simplified form had to be developed. I think there was a period of a few months right at the beginning there where we were learning how to get that right. And we may not have managed to get it right in all circumstances.
And the grant offer?
Yeah, the third point on the grant offer, I think that might relate to letters of offer that were made to individuals around February, March time, towards the end of the financial year. And the commitment that we made at that point in time, following quite rightly criticism externally, was that they shouldn't be time bound, that individuals should be able to uptake the grants when they want. So during the month of April, May, June, July, we continued processing those grant offers, even though technically the letter of offer was up until the 31st of March 2014. Unfortunately, with the budget reduction to £10 million at that point in time, we couldn't afford to continue with those grant offers. And again, with the small budget we had available at that point in time, prioritising chronic pain needs, we had to then in August say circumstances have changed, and unfortunately we're going to have to cease these letters of offer.
In the original offer, does it say explicitly that it expires on whatever date?
31st of March 2014. If you have examples where you think that's not the case, I'd be happy to look at those, but certainly the system at the time is...
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Can I finish with one question about premises? Mr. Moutry highlighted concerns about Dungannon. How are those all addressed?
I'll answer it in two parts. One, as a board, we are looking at the issue of premises because, yet again, we're asking ourselves the question, can we move to premises which are cheaper than what we currently have?
This is headquarters.
This is in both.
Both.
Right.
So we are actively looking at that. We can see that there is a much cheaper option for headquarters, and we are planning to move with the usual contractual commitments, probably by April of next year. We are currently looking at Dungannon to see, is there a cheaper option there? And if there is, then in talking to our staff and in talking to CRC, Community Relations Council, who also have an interest there, we will try and find something that saves some money so that we can put more of that money into the services that we're trying to provide.
Okay.
Just a comment. If you contact the Dungannon District Council, they will have a list of vacant properties within Dungannon town, so
Okay.
that may be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I want to acknowledge, as others have, and thank you, not just for coming today, but the tone and the spirit in which you've engaged with the committee. And I'd like Oliver to end on as optimistic a point as possible. So can I ask you to leave the resources to one side, because we've acknowledged how important they are and how they are impacting so negatively on what you aspire to do. But in the big picture, there has been this, I've always felt that what we wanted to do was establish a flow where you would have a strategy, which we have, a commission, which we have, a service, which we have, and a forum, which we have. So leaving aside the fact maybe there isn't enough money flowing through, are you optimistic that the structure, the architecture is in place, it's the right architecture, and if there was enough resource, this is the model that will work and deliver for victims and survivors?
Yes, this is the model that will work. And it's not all about money. I think there is a better way in which, now that we are working in partnership with one another, we can share ideas about how we can do it better. For me, over the next year, 2 years, that has to be the priority for all of us. Although this is a very difficult position to be in, we're nevertheless in a good position, and I have quite a positive view of how things can be if we put our minds to it over the next year.
Oliver and Margaret, thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our final briefing, members, is from departmental officials. They have not issued a paper. I understand they feel that the best course of action is to respond to the issues that have been raised in our previous session. I mentioned earlier in table papers at page 5, you have a response from our queries of the 11th of September with regard to funding, running costs, and so on. So we welcome to the table Patricia McIntyre and Ricky Irwin. Ricky, can I begin? We heard, I thought, very telling testimony, particularly from Margaret, about what it's like to work in the Victims and Survivors Service, the relentless flow of telephone conversations. Sorry, I'll pause to welcome the committee. Mr. Roy Beggs,
apologies, I was in a neighbouring committee,
who was with the PAC, I believe, so you're very welcome, Roy. Oh yes, this kind of, you're working in the VSS, there's this kind of unending demand to answer telephone calls. We know some of them are from vulnerable people with major issues. Some of these calls will last 30 minutes, 60 minutes. As Margaret said, staff are offered supervision, which I believe is just another word for counselling on a monthly basis. My question then is, does the department have a duty of care to the staff of the VSS?
Well, before I get into opening remarks, just to answer the point, Chair, absolutely. I think as an arm's length body of the department, the department clearly has a duty of care towards the staff there. The VSS is a company limited by guarantee. It has its own independent board, permanent board. It will primarily be the responsibility of the board to ensure, and the SMT to ensure, that the structures are in place to protect staff there. But of course, the department works very closely with VSS on matters such as that. And I think Oliver and Margaret very clearly articulated the pressures that the organisation is under. I would commend the two of them for their leadership over recent months, and in fact I would commend the determination of all the staff in VSS in recent months, particularly in light of the increase in phone calls, the number of unscheduled appointments, and the financial context. I think, and this committee has already acknowledged the pressure and the fact that they have been able to keep the service going through all of that. So absolutely, we would be there.
So how do you discharge that duty of care?
Well, we work very closely, as Margaret and Oliver said, with them. We have a good collaborative partnership. The Commission has commented on the strength of the relationship between the Commission, the Department and VSS and the Forum, the architecture which you referred to earlier. So we are in regular contact with them. We have provided additional resource, and Margaret outlined what that was. We put in place the additional capacity to deal with the phone calls through NI Direct. As Margaret said, we're looking at a request in terms of more resource around merging information together within the VSS. So we have been doing everything that we can, and certainly within my powers and within the powers of the branch within the department, we're trying to do as much as we can to support them through this time.
Okay. Well, obviously the key document between yourselves and an arm's length body is the MSFM, the Management Statement Financial Memorandum. Could we have sight of that to see where that duty of care is articulated in that key document? Well,
That's something that I'll have to take back to the department. I'm not sure in terms of the policy around the sharing of MSFMs between the department and its ALB, so I'll have to take that request back.
I would make that formal request, and if there's a difficulty, I would be satisfied to see that part of the MSFN that covers the duty of care to the staff of the Victims and Survivors Service. The finance is still not clear, Ricky, why we have the VSS saying the opening budget position for 14-15 was communicated in May 14 as 11.7 million. Can you explain that, because it's at variance from what the ministers are saying?
Well, I mean, yes, I obviously this is a point that will need clarification. I mean, could I suggest that perhaps it's within my opening remarks, if further clarification is required, then at that point we'll try to address it.
You know there were going to be opening remarks? No, there was no indication of opening remarks. I beg your pardon. If
Sorry,
you indicated,
okay.
I would have started with that. Go ahead.
Okay, all right, thanks. So since I last updated the committee on the 25th of June, there have been a number of developments. As I explained at my last appearance, the programme board that was established had agreed to stand down as it had carried out its terms of reference at that stage. However, we do have new structures in place, and we continue to monitor the recommendations from the independent assessment of the VSS, which the Commissioner had called for. I'm pleased to report that 47 of the recommendations have been completed and 18 are partially completed. A further 4 are understood to have been completed and will be signed off very soon. The Commission has engaged again with SIPFA and WKM Solutions to undertake a follow-up review, and this has actually commenced today. In 2014-15, the VSS continues to provide funding to individual victims and survivors through the Individual Needs Programme and to victims groups through the Victim Support Programme. Over the summer months, the service opened a number of its schemes to help individuals, including the Financial Assistance Scheme 6, Care for Carers and Support for the Injured. The Financial Assistance Scheme 6 opened in 2 phases. So Phase 1 was for the seriously injured, and Phase 2 for all other applicants, both existing and new. Each successful applicant to Phase 1 was awarded £1,000, as Margaret outlined earlier. The amount of each award for Phase 2 was calculated by dividing the total budget equally between the number of eligible applicants received by the service, and all eligible applicants to Phase 2 then were awarded and have been paid £650. Other individual schemes, primarily respite breaks and education and training, have been deferred, and again Margaret outlined that. The Executive applied a 2.1% reduction in resource budgets immediately in June monitoring, and signalled a further 2.3% reduction in resource budgets in October monitoring. Consequently, the VSS was asked to apply 4.4% of efficiencies from its running costs and from the running costs of the groups funded under the Victim Support Programme. The Department wrote to the VSS Interim Chair on the 21st of July to advise of its initial allocation for 14-15 and to set out an agreed policy framework for it to apply operational discretion in the allocation of its budget. That framework indicated that VSS should take into account consultation with the Victims Forum and the Commission for Victims and Survivors. that it should also continue to protect those victims and survivors with the greatest needs and suffering the most, and it should continue to meet the needs of individual victims and survivors. The service has consequently been proactively managing its budget to maintain frontline services by seeking to achieve savings in administration. It is also working closely with groups and will continue to prioritise the needs of individuals in order to protect those with the greatest needs. The service is committed to maximising any cost savings internally to ensure minimum impact on its operation. The June monitoring executive paper recognised concerns around resource funding for victims and survivors, and the executive agreed to return to this issue in October monitoring, with a view to providing additional resources if at all possible. The department therefore made a bid of 1.3 million in October monitoring in order to restore the VSS budget to a baseline of 11.3 million, which was the same as its opening 13-14 budget. Again, I'm pleased to report that in relation to the competition to appoint a new Victims Commissioner, we are at an advanced stage in that process and interviews are scheduled to occur next week. Additionally, in relation to the appointment of a new VSS permanent chair and additional board members, the positions are currently advertised and we're seeking applications by the closing date of the 17th of October. We're continuing to work closely with the Service and the Commission to ensure that VSS directs funding to those victims and survivors most in need. Indeed, the Commission has recently reported that the tripartite relationship has significantly improved in recent months. Members should also be aware that we're in discussion with health officials on how best to meet the growing psychological needs of victims through the potential enhancement of service provision in the primary healthcare sector. We intend to carry out a collaborative design approach with key stakeholders across the victim sector in the coming weeks to look at how best to meet the needs of victims going forward. Currently, there are evaluations being carried out commissioned by the Commission itself in relation to the individual funding programme and the group funding programme, and this will inform our work in terms of the collaborative design approach and how best to structure services in the future. Chair, that concludes the opening remarks, so happy to take any questions that members may have.
Yes, thank you very much. Can I take you back to the letter you said that was written on the 21st of July advising VSS of their budget for 14-15? Unless I'm mistaken, I think you had an Ed Miliband moment because you didn't mention the money.
In the letter?
Yes.
Well, there was a letter that went at the end of July that said the initial allocation for the service was £10 million. Right. Yes.
Okay.
I mean, at this point, maybe what I should do, just to clarify the financial position, is to look at how it was explained by the Department's accounting officer last week. So if I could just use his words to explain how that position has come about. So, as part of the planning of the budget at the start of the year, the Department identified the programmes that had to be taken forward. In the past number of years, it's been the case that we've received fairly significant funding in year because of a number of programmes that are not baseline funded. That's partly because they started after the programme for government. So we've been fairly heavily reliant on in-year funding. Part of our budgetary planning for the year is to live within a certain degree of pressure, and for that to be picked up through in-year bids. As part of that, we were bidding for the VSS in June with the intention of restoring it to its baseline that it had in the previous year. Unfortunately, that bid was not successful. The Executive, as I said earlier, have committed to look at it again in October, and we remain optimistic that £1.3 million high priority or inescapable bid, in fact, would be met as an outcome of an October monitoring process. Now, you've already reflected the fact that there are two bids in October monitoring, 1.3 and one for 1.7 million.
Okay, but okay, sorry to interrupt, but okay. You're saying that the VSS was first advised of its 14-15 budget on the 21st of July and the figure was 10 million. The VSS have told us in a briefing paper that the opening budget was communicated to them in May 2014 and it was 11.7, and I still don't see the explanation
Well, you're absolutely right. There are the facts. The department and the accounting officer issued an initial letter to the accounting officer of VSS, as it did with all its ALBs, and said its budget was 11.685 million. Subsequently, after June monitoring, then there was a letter at the end of July that said the budget initial allocation that VSS has to work within is £10 million, and that is because of pressures which are right across the department's budget.
So they received a cut following June monitoring when they had asked for an extra 1.3.
They did. They received a reduction in their budget.
So they saw, actually, rather than gaining 1.3, they lost 1.685. So there was a swing, effectively, of £3 million.
They saw a reduction in their budget,
Right.
And a commitment to restore to the original baseline of 13-14 by October monitoring.
Okay, I've got you now. I think I've now got it.
Can I ask a quick supplement?
Yes, absolutely.
Can I ask how that £1.685 million reduction equates to a 4.4% reduction?
Well, if you apply a 4.4% reduction to the 11.685 million, it's broadly down to around 11.3 million, which is the baseline for 13-14.
Well, it's 11.171.
Yep. But obviously the department wants to restore as close as it can to the original baseline for 13-14, which actually is a more favourable position of 11.3 as opposed to 11.1. I mean, the reality is that this is not a position that I wanted to be in terms of the budget for VSS. We know, having worked closely with them over the past long while, the pressures that they're under, the levels of demand emerging. I would have liked to have been able to say, here is more money. That is not within my gift. However, I can convey the impact that it's having on victims and survivors to those within the department who obviously need to know and who make the decisions around the budget.
Yeah. Now the 1.3 bid, or was it 1.6? What was the bid in June?
I think it was 1.6 or 1.7.
Yeah, 1.6. And that, as I understand it, was an inescapable bid.
Okay.
And the expectation would be that that's the top priority, and there would be an expectation that inescapable bids would be met. But it wasn't met, but not only was it not met, there was a drop from 11.685 to 10. So actually it's well over 3. It's 1.685 taken off and 1.6 not given. So we're talking way over £3.2 million of a swing from where they felt they needed to be to where they were told they had to manage the account. Alex, would you want to come in on this?
This will probably surprise you, Ricky, but in one way I have a little bit of sympathy with you, because given all of the issues around the VSS, what you didn't want is the VSS so reliant on in-year monies, then at the beginning of this financial year discovering that actually they didn't have all that money. But it does raise a more fundamental point, and that is that somehow or other in your department you are telling an arm's length body that their baseline was their baseline plus monitoring monies. Is there a practice within your department of telling arm's length bodies at the beginning of a financial year, when you notify them about what their budget allocation is, that the budget allocation is your baseline plus whatever you got in monitoring rounds in the previous year? Because if that is the financial practice within your department, then it's a very irregular one.
Well, I mean, that's a question I couldn't answer. Probably more suited to the department's accounting officer in terms of practice across all the ALBs. So I couldn't answer that.
It's irregular what happened here. Well, an arm's length body was told your baseline for this year is your baseline from the previous year plus your monitoring rounds.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if the term irregular in terms of public expenditure applies in this case, but again,
how would you describe it?
Well, as I said, this is not a preferred position to be in when you're acting as a senior sponsor for a fairly important frontline service in the VSS. Nevertheless, the reality is that we have to support VSS in trying to stay within its allocated budget, which at this time is 10 million, and we've worked very hard to try and do that.
Okay, and I suppose on your point, Alex, you know, the Historical Institution Abuse Inquiry, its budget is entirely dependent on monitoring rounds. Ricky, I'm sure you're aware the detail that online journalist facility, talking about the impacts of cuts to services for victims and survivors, got a response out of Sir Kenneth Bloomfield, who wrote the We Will Remember Them, the original report which kicked all this off. Sir Kenneth said that what's going on, quote, is evidence of a dysfunctional system of government and ought to be of great concern to every caring citizen. How do you respond to that statement?
Well, I'm not sure it's within my gift to go into defining what's dysfunctional within government. As I say, I have to work within the parameters that I'm given. We have an MSFM with the ALB. We have a budget allocation. We have a number of pressures, and we have to manage those. So that's what we're doing.
Okay. Okay. There are the two bids in October monitoring, 1.3, 1.7. Which ministerial commitments need that money for you to be able to fulfil every ministerial commitment? What are the outstanding ministerial commitments?
Well, the primary ministerial commitment was explained by Oliver and Margaret around the 24-hour telephone call, key performance indicator, and we're pleased that Margaret was able to say that that has now been restored. There was a short period during September where they weren't able to meet that because of the influx of phone calls, even with the assistance of NI Direct. So that would be the primary ministerial commitment that would have been impacted there.
Can I suggest to you there is another one, which is in fact perhaps trumps the telephone line? In the October monitoring papers, which we received and discussed with your colleagues in the finance side of the department last week, on the 1.7 million, the second bid, in the column or the box headline, consequences if not met, it says the VSS will be unable to meet all targets as outlined above. And above, we read, meet the basic needs and demands of victims and survivors. I would suggest that's more important than a phone line. Without the second bid, without the full 3 million, the VSS will be unable to meet the basic needs and demands of victims and survivors.
Well, I mean, the bid is for £3 million. I put forward the bid based on the information that VSS put to me, including all the consequences and the impact. I think we've heard today that VSS are trying to manage the operational delivery on a day-to-day basis, and I think they're doing a good job based on the resources that they have. That's not to say that there won't be impact on frontline delivery, and there will be. So that line, I think, is reflecting that it's not possible to meet the needs of every single victim and survivor.
It's basic needs, and did you write this?
I didn't write that, no.
Right. Meet the basic needs and demands of victims and survivors. You can't do that without the 3 million. Kenneth Bloomfield says what we have is evidence of a dysfunctional system of government.
I mean, it's important to put that into context in terms of the needs of everyone who has presented to VSS. I mean, as explained, there has been a significant increase in the numbers of people who have come forward. So in order to meet everybody's needs, then there would need to be money as outlined in those
But it's basic.
bids.
You're forgetting that it's basic needs. That's what disturbs me. It doesn't say meet the needs and demands of victims and survivors, because they could be enormous. They might even some demands might even be reasonable. But this says the basic needs.
The service has prioritised its budget in such a way, based on the policy framework provided by the department, to target those most in need, including their basic needs.
Last time you were with us, or previous visit, you talked about gateway processes. Could you just remind me of how that works?
Is that in terms of the revised assessment process?
Well, you ran a gateway, or the VSS ran a gateway process in March of this year. Could you just remind us?
Well, that was explained, I think, by Oliver and Margaret in terms of the follow-on to the original individual needs review, and that was in response to the recommendations arising from the independent report from the Commissioner, which said that the individual needs review needed to be more simplified for victims coming forward. So that's what the gateway is.
Right, and as a consequence of that gateway process, which was run in March of this year, new victims came forward to the VSS, but those new victims have been told the cupboard's bare. We've nothing for you.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to be very frank and say, you know, that figure is around 3,700 people additional who have come forward to the VSS this year.
3,700 people who came forward having been encouraged by yourselves, and now they're being told we don't have anything for you currently.
And it's back to my original point, you know, decisions around the allocation of the budget, unfortunately, are out with my control.
Sure.
But we have to manage as best we can with the budget that's been given to the service.
But I thank you for being frank about that. 3,700 new victims and survivors have come forward, having been encouraged from the department, the VSS and the support groups, and there's nothing for them. Alex Maskey.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Ricky and Patricia, for being here in your presentation. I actually think it's a bit unfortunate that, I mean, I don't recognise the remarks that you attribute to Ken Bloomfield. I mean, I think shortfall of funding and all the rest of that is one issue. I don't see the jump from that to dysfunctional government. There may well be other examples of problems around government, but don't necessarily see that as one. So I think it's unfortunate that was introduced, because I don't share that. I do share the concern, and everybody else around the table, including yourself, about the lack of enough funding to meet everybody's needs. I actually took it from what Ricky had said earlier on, that the issue around the baseline was because the growing demand has outstripped the commitments made of the programme for government, which is why you then try to rely on additional money in year to meet those growing needs. I don't think anybody would have anticipated 3,000 plus additional cases this year alone. I don't think anybody would have predicted that. Maybe we should have done whenever the whole house negotiations were going on for quite a considerable period of time. That might have heightened people's awareness that they would like something done. And I think we need to take note of that, all of us around the table. One of the things that I wanted to ask, in terms of, is there any sense of trying to work out, can there be a new baseline established? So, I mean, that's the one thing, and I mean, it's not applicable just to here. Other departments do likewise. Danny Kennedy a week ago explained problems that he has. So he has a baseline, and then he tries to year on year or in year to get additional money for the services. So I'd like to know, is there any sense of, can we reach a new realistic baseline given the increasing demands? And if we do, if we can, then if you might have some views around that. And the other point I think which is important for us, given the work that's been going on, and I thought the very positive presentation early on from Margaret and Oliver, when would you envisage all the kind of structures being fleshed out, and in other words being complete again? I think that's obviously a big focus of this committee for some time now, and obviously yourselves, and yourself in particular, I have to say.
Well, I think that those two issues are linked in terms of whatever a new baseline would be, and then what structures would look like. We're in the preliminary stages of this collaborative design approach. Nothing's been agreed. We want to make sure that we talk to all the key stakeholders, including individuals and victims groups, Commission, Forum, yourselves, the service, about what a model would look like going forward, which would be sustainable. And Oliver said that demand will increase, and you know that's not sustainable in terms of finding the additional resource in this current climate. So I think until we have what the model would look like, then we would be able to establish what the baseline funding would be for that in order to deliver the model and to meet the needs of victims who present through that model. So this is not about rushing in to anything. To be clear, the department has taken on the chin the criticisms and the mistakes made in the establishment of VSS, and when I was here with Dennis before, we went through all of that. Let's not make the same mistakes. Let's make sure that we get this right. And one of the things that we need to make sure is that in any model, that it's client-centred, that it's about the victims, and that it's responsive to meeting their needs and all of their needs. So I'm very clear that as we go forward, that's my vision and my aim for getting this right. So whatever amount of money that costs, that will be what we will have to bid for and ensure that we secure as the baseline.
Thank you. And the second point, sorry, Chair, was the issue of the structures. I mean, you mentioned earlier on they're close to the appointed maybe a new commissioner, and then talked about the CEO giving interim one there in terms of the service and the board and the chair and all the rest of that. Have you any time frame when all that might be complete?
Well, I can't go into too much detail about the commissioner competition because I chair the selection panel and the interviews are next week. So based on that, I would like to think that decisions would flow quite quickly over the coming weeks in terms of an incoming commissioner, subject to the outcome of the interviews.
Sure.
In terms of a new permanent chair and additional board members, the advert is currently live, and I think it doesn't close until the middle of October. So again, I'll be chairing the panel in terms of selection, and we will obviously make recommendations to ministers after that. So I would like to think over the next few weeks we'll be able to announce new board members onto the board of VSS.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Deputy Chair Chris Little.
Thanks, Chair. Again, in an effort to try and be fair to you, I don't think any of us can forget the scale of the challenge that the department is endeavouring to respond to here. The amount of people that were killed, seriously injured, or affected as a result of that. But it is our responsibility to try and drill down into changes. So in April, the VSS was notified that it had a budget for this financial year of £11.685 million. In July, it was advised that that was being reduced to £10 million. It's a £1.685 million reduction, which by my calculations is 14.4%. Can you tell me why it was a 14.4% reduction, given that the standard reduction requested of departments was 4.4%?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, I've gone over that in terms of how it was 11.685 and why in July it was 10 million. It was 10 million with the intention of restoring it to 11.3 million as quickly as possible. The 11.685 million, when you apply the 4.4, is broadly in line with the 11.3 million. So I mean, I can't go into any more information than that.
So you're making public financial statements based on money that doesn't exist. So I mean, it's factually inaccurate. Public finance statements are being made.
Well, in what context? Because the 10 million pounds.
What context is there to that?
The £10 million is the allocation. That is the reality. That is the budget that VSS has to work within. Alongside that allocation, a commitment was made by the executive to revisit the position in October monitoring. Now, we don't know what the outcome of October monitoring will be,
and we know that a previous inescapable bid wasn't successful as well.
But the sense that I got, and the sense that we conveyed very strongly to VSS, was that the outcome of an October monitoring bid would be successful.
Which also is halfway through the financial year already as well.
Well, unfortunately, that's again out with my direct control, and you know, all I can say again is this is not the preferred way that we would do this.
That's a mild way to describe it, to be honest.
But nevertheless, we have to work within the budget that we've got, and we have to support VSS, and that's what we're trying to do.
Okay, can I ask, in line with my opening comment, has there ever been any undertaking to try and map the amount of victims and survivors who fall within the definition under the Victims and Survivors Order that the Victims and Survivors Service might be expected to provide services for? Because it seems like we're grossly out in terms of the resources that are available vis-a-vis the amount of victims and survivors that may be in legitimate need of those services.
I mean, just to go back to the point about the 3,700 before I answer that, these are additional people who presented to VSS, but we don't know how many of those are already receiving support through the groups, and I would suspect a large number of them are. and they now feel that they can come forward to the VSS as well as the support they receive from the groups. It is very difficult to get an actual grasp on the hard numbers and statistics around the number of victims. The VSS gathers information from the groups that it funds. There are numbers there in terms of people who are being supported, but what we don't know is if a person goes to multiple groups, and that happens, to get the best possible support. So there hasn't been a mapping exercise per se, but we know that the evaluation that's currently being carried out by RSM at Clearwaters on behalf of the Commission is currently looking at the group funding and the individual needs funding, so we'll want to take a close look at the recommendations that come out of that to try and maximise the value for money.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Okay. Ms. Grant.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I want to acknowledge, Ricky, the amount of work that you have put into and the department has put into sorting out many of the problems that just a year ago existed, and I think other members have acknowledged that. Can I ask you, in terms of, given that I suspect that there'll be a press release about 3,777 victims not getting any money or not being looked after, I assume they're on a list and they will, whenever finance may become available, be dealt with. Perhaps the cake or the amount of money for others may get smaller in the future in terms of all of the extra people coming forward. But can I ask you, in terms of many of the people that's coming forward, and one of the issues that was raised before was psychological problems that people were suffering from. And there was a discussion that took place in relation to signposting people to, for instance, it may well be to the Department of Health, it may well be to other areas within departments. How much has that been taken on board, and how much of that is actually happening? Because in many cases, those with serious psychological difficulties, and may well be, I'm not criticising any of the groups, by the way, but maybe people who aren't properly trained are not the best people to be dealing with people who have got real trauma. They may well approach and they may well express the problems that they have, but they need to be moved on to the expert, to the individual who is trained to deal with that sort of trauma or to deal with that sort of psychological problem that exists over many, many years. What discussions have taken place, and is there a possibility of other departments being able to take up some of the problems? Because that, in another way, is helping some of the victims that's coming forward, and it's something that certainly was raised 12 months ago.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, on the first point, I mean, again, to reiterate that of that figure that I've quoted, we don't know, but I suspect a large number are already receiving support through groups. If the VSS is successful in securing additional money, its intention is to try and meet that additional demand. On the second point, I mean, you're absolutely right. We have been talking to Department of Health officials about how we can look at mainstreaming some psychological trauma provision within the primary healthcare sector. This would be about ensuring that victims are receiving the support that they need in a safe and regulated environment, and that's very important for people who have deep psychological needs. Now, just to say as well that the groups are doing an awful lot of work around health and well-being and social support, and some of that health and well-being work includes counselling, and a large number of groups have registered and accredited counsellors on their books who do provide maybe step 1, step 2 care for victims with psychological needs. When it gets into a higher intensity of needs, step 3, 4 and 5, you move into the primary healthcare sector and into the professional sphere, which should be looking after those people. Now, at the minute, there is signposting that goes on, and people are signposted to their GP or into other provision which is currently provided and funded through the Department of Health. But we at the minute are talking to senior officials in health about how we can enhance a trauma care model, which would not only provide good outcomes for victims, but actually good outcomes in terms of mental health for the entire population here, because there is an opportunity to look at the amount of money which is available for victims and to say, is this being spent in the best way? So these discussions are at the early stages. The Health and Social Care Board have proposed a model for trauma care. It would be a model that would work in partnership with the groups as well, because we have to recognise the capacity that exists there. So that's our direction of travel. Again, I don't want to rush things and get this wrong. We have to make sure that we get this right. But I would be confident that we'll be able to put in place a model which will provide better value for money and meet people's needs when they need it met.
Yeah, I personally, I think a model that takes society on board, the mental health and well-being of the entire community is well worth pursuing, Ricky. Alex Hadwood.
You mentioned earlier that we had to get this right, and obviously everybody would agree with that. One point it did differ with Oliver is that he thought over the next 2 years the VSS can become what it was meant to be. My own view is that it's better to devolve responsibilities to the most authoritative groups within the victims and survivors world than to concentrate and institutionalise it in the VSS. So I do actually differ fundamentally in the direction of some of this. But you said that the programme board has been stood down, and as of today, well, there's a new structure in place, you said.
Well, not as of today, but over recent months.
Yes. What's the new structure?
Well, we have regular meetings where the Commission come along to meet senior officials, including myself, and special advisors to provide an update on their assessment of where things are with victims and the victim service. So it's what we call a victims update meeting we hold on a monthly basis.
So a programme board that was taken forward, the recommendations around the VSS has been stood down and replaced with a monthly meeting between officials, SPADs and the VSS.
Well, that's right, but just to follow the process through, the implementation of the 70 recommendations is still within the agenda of that meeting.
Right.
And following every meeting, I personally write to Oliver as interim chair and outline what has been discussed and where the main focus from the department's perspective is. And alongside that, of course, we still continue to meet with the victim service directly on a monthly basis around governance and performance targets and all of that. So it's a fairly robust structure, and its aim is to ensure the follow through of all the recommendations.
Like my own sense again is that if the Victims Commissioner formally alerted a year ago of our concerns, and that then now concede that you had to use your language, take it on the chin. I think it was a bit more than that myself. It seemed to me that all hands needed to stay on deck to get this rectified, and that a monthly meeting without a programme board seems to me to be less of a dedicated way to do that work. A programme or a monthly meeting, by the way, Chair, that doesn't seem to involve junior ministers, only is only dealt with at an official level. So I worry about that structure, frankly, given the scale of where we were and given the continued. But given that you say that it's robust, through all those meetings and given this robust nature, did anyone ever say to the VSS, by the way, your baseline figure that you're working from might be wrong?
Well, I mean, I think I've covered the issue of
I know you have, but only in this robust process that you've now adopted rather than the programme board, has it not come up in some meeting somewhere that actually in May you got a letter of grant, but the baseline was just wrong? Because if it doesn't seem to me the process that we now have is very robust.
Well, I mean, it absolutely does come up in terms of the report provided by the Commission on what the impact of the budget reductions are, and that's a very transparent report, which clearly outlines what those are. And so of course that is taken on board.
Somehow this new process that followed the standing down at the programme board somehow missed a fundamental issue like, by the way, we gave you the wrong figure on your baseline that you're operating from.
If I could just come in again, I mean, to be clear as well, the VSS is an arm's length body of the department. It has its own board, it is a company limited by guarantee, and it does have an amount of operational discretion. So it's important that the department remains within its remit and the VSS is allowed to operate that operational discretion. So that is part of the rationale for the change in the structure as well. And it's not about stepping back and taking your foot off the gas in terms of what needs to be done. It's about respecting the relationship with VSS. And I think, and if I can say, you know, the confidence that we have now in terms of the board members and the SMT, and I appreciate that both Margaret and Oliver are both interim, they've really stepped up to the challenge here, and they have to be commended for that.
Sorry, Alex, if you don't mind, but without sight of the MSFM, we don't know what the proper relationship is.
Mm-hmm. And we all acknowledge that. You were at the earlier session, and we all acknowledge.
Yeah.
I'm just pointing out that we've replaced one robust procedure with one that you say is robust, but somehow missed in all this what the true baseline was. Can I ask you the second question then is, has there been any discussion at a ministerial level following July monitoring and now, just to say the VSS needs to be ring-fenced from any reductions?
Well, they may be discussions that are above my head, and I haven't been party to any meetings where that has been discussed.
But given your knowledge about all of this and given the scale, like, I don't know how many times you've been before the committee about this issue, probably too many for your appointment, but given all of that,
yeah,
you know, should we just not just say, or should officials say, ring fence the VSS monies? It's within the gift of ministers.
Ring fence almost.
I think you're absolutely right. It's within the gift of ministers, but it's a ministerial decision and not one which I am going to make on their behalf.
Well, you might want to consider passing a paper to them saying, here is one of your options. And then the final thing is that we keep getting told about there's, you know, so many of the recommendations of the review have been implemented, mm-hmm. and partially, and now there's 3 or 4 that have been implemented, but new ones have been implemented. We just don't know,
okay,
in terms of hard detail. So we've previously raised this. I think there's probably some process whereby we're going to get that information. I think we need to see it.
Sorry, I thought that the service did provide that report directly. Mm-hmm. So I thought you had that.
It's in the back guy.
Yeah.
The full detail one, is it?
Pretty detailed.
Then I stand corrected.
Okay, thanks.
We'll come back to questions on that then later.
Okay, we're going so well. Roy Vex.
Again, thank you for your presentation. You've indicated that considerable numbers of victims who are new to the service have been coming forward, and to a degree you've been having difficulty in catering for their needs, and that in terms of that there's been a lot of psychological issues where step 1, step 2 are dealt with by the groups, but that the higher levels of needs are really direct towards the health service. Are you able to put any collective number, the number of individuals that have actually come forward through this route to require that additional work with the health service to try and address issues of violence that they've met in their lives during the years of terrorism?
Unfortunately, I wouldn't have that data, and that's probably a question that could have been put to Oliver and Margaret before us today, and they may have been able to provide that, but certainly I can try to come back to you on that.
Yeah, I think it would be very, very useful. And you'd also mentioned that there'd been discussions with the health service about this area of work. Last week, I unearthed from the Health Trust there on a projected deficit of 130 million. So what is the likelihood of them providing this additional service in the area of mental health, which is already an area which is relatively underfunded and recognised as a Bamford report, etc.?
Well, what we've got to look at is, obviously, health officials will be talking to us in the context of their pressures right across their service. But for us, and for me personally, this is about trying to make sure that we can get a model which will have better outcomes for victims, and if that should be sitting within a regulated and safe environment, which I think it should be, and I think that was acknowledged by the previous Commissioner as well, it will be up to us to make sure that whatever model is implemented does actually deliver for those victims. I don't want to preempt the direction of travel and the outcome of those discussions, but that's what I'm aiming to achieve.
Do you see the step 1, step 2 staying with the various groups where they have that better access to individuals to help to get some initial assistance and to perhaps draw them in and signpost them, point them towards other services where other professionals would be available?
I mean, possibly. I think what we need to acknowledge is that the groups are providing an invaluable service here, particularly around social support, befriending and respite breaks. And that is because certain individual victims feel more confident in going to those groups. So, of course, we have to consider how best to utilise that going forward, and that may look like a model which does involve the groups. I think we absolutely have to look at that. But it's back to a point which I think was made. It was made yesterday in the motion in the chamber and here today again. There are more groups than ever. There are groups who have split and become groups. There are increasing pressures on the budget within VSS, and it simply can't provide letters of offer to all the groups who have presented to it. So we have to look at a model now which will be more strategic in nature. What we don't want to have is provision of funding to groups where there's overlap, and then where there are gaps as well within communities and where we know there is need. So I'm not sure that has been done before, but that's certainly something that we want to look at now. And I'm very keen to get the report from RSM McClure Waters, which the Commission has started, which will hopefully guide us in that direction as to how to address that particular problem. So again, that's all in the mix going forward.
You mentioned gaps there, and when I looked through the number of groups that are funded throughout different counties in Northern Ireland and towns, I noticed very, very few from the Carrickfergus area, if any. I don't think I noticed any from the Carrickfergus area yet. There's a high preponderance of former police officers, perhaps those who serve with UDR, Royal Irish in that area. Would you recognise that as being a gap?
Well, I mean, that level of detail I haven't got into, and I suppose this is where we need to rely on the experts and on the people who are dealing day and daily with victims. We do need to try and tackle that, and we need to have that strategic approach, and if there are gaps that exist such as that, then they need to be dealt with. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Two to finish, Ricky, if you don't mind. We've got these two bids for a total of 3 million in October monitoring. Are there any contingency plans should either or both fail?
Well, obviously the primary concern is for mitigating the impact on frontline services, and that's where we need to support the service as it works with those groups to implement the 4.4% reduction. The service, being a company limited by guarantee, it will have certain legal and statutory requirements that it has to meet. So we will have to make sure that happens. Unfortunately, beyond that, I can't give any more detail because this is really about having the resources there, and we don't know the outcome of October monitoring, so we can't really go into any more than that.
Okay.
Okay.
That sounds like there is not a contingency. Finally then, there is a strategy for victims and survivors. It's a 10-year strategy. It was published 5 years ago. Is there a mid-term review?
Well, I think we've now entered a period where we are reviewing the strategy. We've talked about the architecture. We've talked about the need in the context of constrained budgets to look at how best to provide services. So I think while no formal review has been announced, effectively what we're doing here is a mid-term review 5 years into a 10-year strategy. On the previous point about a contingency, obviously we will want to work closely with the VSS because they're the people at the front line in terms of service provision, and they will help us put together a contingency plan. So those are discussions that I will have with Margaret over the coming weeks. In fact, we've been having those discussions, to be fair, over previous weeks as well, so that will continue.
Okay.
Okay.
Ricky, Patricia, thank you both very much.
Thanks.
Members, thank you. Can I just bring the meeting to an end by referring you to the draft forward work programme on page 134 of your packs? In the absence of anybody commenting on that, open to any other business?
Chair, can I just ask when the ministers are next scheduled to be with us? It's my understanding that given the scale and impact of many of the budgetary reductions, other ministers have gone to their respective committees to give account for what's taking place, and I can't help but feel that officials are limited to a certain extent in terms of how much account they can give for some of this.
Well, I got a sense today that October monitoring may be resolved sooner rather than later. Perhaps post-resolution would be a good time to ask for a briefing.
Okay.
Members?
Depends how long it takes.
Also, members, if you remember, Shona McGeehan, our EU Affairs Manager, produced a very useful EU Matters magazine. The department have asked if we can share it with them. Happy? Yeah, excellent. Any other business? If not, the next meeting is next Wednesday, 15th, 2 p.m, room 30, meeting adjourned.
Assembly Committee